The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the constancy of a machine that had never stopped humming, not in 43 years of Sacred Heart's operation. Sarah Chen moved through the recovery ward at 11:22 p.m. like she was part of that machinery, necessary, competent, invisible. Her scrubs were the color of pale blue walls. Her name badge hung at an angle that made it hard to read. She had learned, over 18 years of night shifts, that invisibility was a kind of armor. The antiseptic smell hung in the corridors like a held breath. Stainless steel bed rails gleamed under the harsh white light. She checked the med cart against her clipboard, 73 patient names, 14 rooms down the east corridor, 12 down the west. The rhythm was familiar enough that her hands moved through it without requiring her attention. Which was good, because her attention was elsewhere, locked in a place she was never supposed to access again. 20 years ago, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had stopped existing. The military saw to that. They erased her from the rosters, redacted her name from incident reports, and handed her a civilian ID at Joint Base Ballard with instructions that were simple and absolute: you will not speak of Tikrit. You will not speak of the operation. You will not speak of the children. If anyone asks, you were a field medic with supply logistics. If anyone pushes, you have no comment. Your security clearance is permanently revoked. Your rank is buried. The woman you were is gone. Walk away and stay gone. She had walked away. For 2 decades, she had lived in the margins, night shifts that kept her out of the sun, efficiency that kept her off the radar, a life so small that no one would ever think to ask what a 48-year-old night nurse was before she became this. Except the hands. The hands always remembered. Room for 12 held a sleeping patient, post-op from a femur repair. Sarah checked the 4 line with the precision of someone who had once started an 4 line on a child while mortar fire punched holes in the building around her. The catheter was clear, the drip rate correct. She pressed her palm against the cold steel of the bed rail, feeling the tiny vibration of the hospital's electrical pulse, and let herself breathe. The patient in room for 14 was awake at this hour. James Morrison. Private first class, post-op day 3 from a knee reconstruction. She had read his chart with a detachment of professional habit, 28 years old, Army Ranger, first deployment 7 years ago. The file listed his parents as emergency contact. It did not list a child he had pulled from rubble in 2004. It did not list the woman who had held that child in one arm while returning fire with the other. The military was good at writing stories that left out the important parts. Sarah entered his room with a blood pressure cuff and a pulse oximeter. Morrison was awake, staring at the ceiling with the particular 1,000-yard focus of someone whose body had betrayed him. Combat boots sat by his bedside, well-worn, scuffed at the heels, the leather creased in the exact pattern of 2 decades of deployment. She recognized those boots the way soldiers recognized each other across crowded rooms. The pattern of wear told a story: Kandahar, then Ramadi, then somewhere in the Levant. The boots had been to war more times than Morrison had been alive when she last saw him. Vitals check, she said quietly. No more than necessary. This was her way. Morrison turned his head. His eyes were brown with flecks of amber. She remembered those eyes at 8 years old, terrified in a hospital in Ballard, reaching for her hand between rounds of antibiotics. Now those same eyes studied her face with the attentive wariness soldiers developed after multiple deployments. The look of someone who had learned that any detail might save your life. "Haven't seen you before," he said. His voice had the rough grain of someone recovering from anesthesia. "Night shift. 2 years." She wrapped the cuff around his bicep, noting the corded muscle beneath, the surgical scar running the length of his upper arm, older than his current injury. Blood pressure's 128/82. The knee. How's the reconstruction? Perfect alignment. Physical therapy starts in 72 hours. She removed the cuff with economical movements. Ice and elevation. Nothing under 10 pounds for 4 weeks. Morrison nodded, accepting this with the obedience of someone who understood chain of command. She turned to leave, and he did not call her back. That was good. That was necessary. The less he looked at her, the less chance he had of seeing what she actually was beneath the scrubs and the name badge hanging at an angle. But she had felt it, that moment of recognition that did not yet know what it was recognizing. The way the body remembers things the mind cannot access. 2 decades of distance, and still that pull. The ward was quiet in the way hospital wards are quiet, never truly silent, because the machines never stopped talking. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. Heart monitors beeped in steady conversation. Someone's pump beeped softly, demanding attention. Sarah moved through this soundscape like a conductor moving through an orchestra she could hear and others could not. The break room smelled of stale coffee and microwaved chicken. She sat at the small table with her own thermos, black coffee from home, no sugar, and opened her charting tablet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Through the small window in the break room door, she could see the nurses' station and the main corridor beyond, where other staff moved in their own rhythms. None of them looked her direction. None of them ever did. This was the life she had chosen. Or the life the military had chosen for her and she had accepted without argument. This was the distance she maintained, not unfriendly, but unremarkable. Not cold, but cool. The kind of nurse that patients appreciated when they needed her and forgot 5 minutes after she left the room. The kind of presence that registered as competent but not memorable. The kind of woman that the world could pass by without ever knowing what she carried beneath the surface. She had been very good at disappearing. The night was scheduled to continue in that way, the quiet rhythm of vital signs and charting, the occasional page, the predictable motion of patients sleeping and machines monitoring and time moving forward in increments marked by digital clocks. Sarah finished her coffee at 12:38 a.m. and began her second round of checks, starting with the East Corridor. Each room followed its own pattern. Each patient nodded or slept or required small adjustments to comfort. Her hands moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. It was during the third check, in room 406, that the door to the ward burst open with enough force to turn heads. A man entered, not running, but moving with the kind of deliberate authority that made people step back without him speaking. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver threading through dark hair and wearing the kind of suit that cost more than most nurses made in a month. His eyes moved across the ward like he was cataloguing inventory. He stopped at the nurse's station, and something in his bearing changed, shifted into a smile that did not reach those calculating eyes. "Chief of Surgery," he said to the night charge nurse. "Dr. Marcus Sterling. Just checking on our post-ops before I head home." Sterling. The new hire. Sarah had heard his name in the way night shift staff heard administrative changes, relevant only if they affected patient care. She continued her charting without looking up, but she felt the moment his eyes moved in her direction. The particular weight of a gaze that had decided you were something worth examining more closely. He moved through the ward with the confidence of someone who had already decided the hierarchy here, like everything else in his life, was his to rearrange. And when he paused outside Morrison's room and glanced at the chart, then glanced at Sarah, something shifted in the air of Sacred Heart's Recovery Ward. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder. The chart Sterling had been studying wasn't Morrison's vitals anymore. It was Sarah herself, the way she moved between beds, the economy of her motions, the absence of any wasted gesture. He'd been at Sacred Heart for 6 weeks. Long enough to notice that the night shift nurse moved like someone accustomed to operating in spaces where mistakes cost lives. He filed that observation away and began his work in earnest. The next morning, Sarah's charting appeared on the unit board, the one visible to every staff member who passed through the recovery ward. The note was written in Sterling's precise handwriting, blue ink on white paper, impossible to miss. 2-minute delay in recording post-operative vitals for room 412. The timestamp was 2:22 a.m. It was a minor infraction, the kind that happened on every shift, the kind that nobody normally documented. It was also positioned directly beside the daily census count where 30 people would see it before noon. Sarah didn't react when she saw it. She'd been expecting something. Sterling had a particular way of moving through the ward in the evenings, a hunting walk, calculated and slow. She'd seen it before in men whose power came from institutional authority rather than earned respect. The kind of men who built themselves up by making others smaller. She continued her rounds. Checked medication drips. Documented output. Adjusted a patient's pillow at 4:15 a.m. when nobody was watching. If the charting violation bothered her, nobody could tell. Her hands remained steady as they recorded vital signs. Her voice carried the same professional distance it always did. But 3 nurses were talking in the break room when she came in on her next shift. They stopped talking when she entered. That was the second stage of it, the orchestrated silence, the coordinated distance. Sterling had spoken to them individually, she realized. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. One by one, in his office with the door closed, with the kind of smile that suggested he was doing them a favor by warning them about Sarah's attitude concerns. Vague, impossible to defend against, designed to spread like a stain. Elena Rodriguez wouldn't make eye contact. Nurse Jasmine Torres suddenly needed to check on a patient in the opposite wing. Only old Mrs. Chen, no relation, though Sarah had never corrected anyone who assumed otherwise, stayed at the table with her coffee growing cold. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "That one has been asking questions about who trained you. Where you came from before you worked agency." Sarah nodded once. Said nothing. What was there to say? The truth was locked away in classified files in a building she could never visit, attached to a woman who no longer legally existed. 2 days later, Sterling did his rounds with an audience. He brought the attending physicians, the residents, Morrison's family, his wife and their daughter, 8 years old, holding a stuffed rabbit. He stood at the foot of Morrison's bed reviewing the chart while Sarah stood at the forestand, checking the flow rate on the post-operative pain management protocol she'd adjusted 40 minutes earlier when Morrison had winced against the pillow. "The patient's discomfort is escalating," Sarah said quietly. "The current dosage appears insufficient. I'd recommend reviewing the..." Sterling's voice cut through hers like a scalpel. "Maybe you should leave clinical decisions to people with actual medical degrees." The words hung in the air. Morrison's wife flinched. The residents looked at their shoes. One of them was young enough to be embarrassed for Sarah, old enough to know it was easier to say nothing. The daughter clutched her rabbit tighter. Sarah took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. When she spoke, she'd already wiped away the single tear that had escaped, that small rebellion of biology she refused to acknowledge. "I'll note your orders in the chart, Doctor." Sterling waited, searching her face for something, a tremor, a break, any small evidence that he'd actually reached her. What he saw instead was a woman whose composure was like watching someone behind bulletproof glass. Present but untouchable. It infuriated him in a way he hadn't anticipated. That evening, Sterling made 3 phone calls from his office. The first was to Dr. Richard Hartwell, who sat on Sacred Heart's board and had helped Sterling secure his position. The second was to a staffing agency supervisor named Marcus Tran, who managed the pool of contract nurses. The third was to a risk management consultant he'd worked with at his previous hospital, a woman named Claire Voss who specialized in documenting liability patterns. "I need someone I trust to do a thorough assessment of our night shift protocols," he told Claire. "Specifically, I'm concerned about an RN who may be overstepping her scope of practice. The charting violations are just the beginning." What Sterling didn't know, what none of them knew, was that James Morrison lay in room for 12 listening to the monitors beep their steady rhythm, and in the darkness of the recovery ward, something was beginning to change. Sterling had activated his network. He'd called in favors, documented paperwork, orchestrated a coordinated campaign of institutional pressure that would have broken most people. He just didn't know who he was really fighting. The rain came early that night, hammering against the east-facing windows of Sacred Heart with the kind of persistence that suggested it planned to stay. Sarah finished her shift at 6:53 a.m. and clocked out with the same efficiency she brought to everything, steady, unremarkable, present. The kind of nurse nobody noticed until something went catastrophically wrong. At 2:15 a.m., 48 hours later, that moment arrived. Morrison's room sat at the end of the north corridor where the monitors clicked their lonely rhythm at 2:41 a.m. Sarah pushed the door open with her hip chart already in motion, eye scanning the post-op checklist before her body had fully crossed the threshold. For hours post-op for a left shoulder repair, routine, stable, textbook recovery. His breathing was even. Oxygen sat at 94% on 2 liters. His vitals glowed steady green across the bedside monitor. She was reaching for his full line to check the drip rate when she heard it, a gasp that had nothing to do with waking up. Morrison's body convulsed upward. His right hand clawed at his chest. His mouth opened but no sound came, only that wet, panicked wheeze, the sound of a man drowning on land. Sarah's eyes snapped to the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 92. 88. 83 and accelerating like a stone down a well. She moved. No hesitation. No call button first. Her hand was already on his shoulder, reading the architecture of his chest wall through the thin hospital gown. His right side. Hard. Rigid. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, the trachea deviating toward his left like a compass needle spinning wrong. His breath came in short, frantic pulls, his lungs screaming for air that couldn't enter because pressure was building on the wrong side of his chest cavity, collapsing the tissue, crushing the vessels. Tension pneumothorax. A lung had ruptured. Air was pouring into the space between his ribs and his pleural membrane, and with every breath he took, more air entered and none escaped. In 7 minutes, his heart would stop. His blood pressure would crater. His pupils would fix and dilate and he would die. The flashback hit without warning, 20 years collapsed into 3 seconds. Mortar fire hammering the compound in Tikrit, dust in the air like a living thing, a child trapped beneath concrete blocks with his right lung collapsed and his eyes rolling back. Blood pooled under his collarbone. His lips were already turning grey. She had been pinned down, returning fire from a kneeling position, her weapon in one hand, and she still somehow had gotten to him, still somehow had her gear, still somehow knew exactly what to do because her hands had done this before and her hands would do this again. The present snapped back. Morrison. Now. 60 seconds left. She moved toward the supply cart. Her hands knew the way. The motion was automatic, muscle memory written in a decade of field surgery where seconds meant the difference between a person walking out or being carried out. She found the 14-gauge angiocath needle in the emergency medications drawer, the same size she had used 1,000 times in places where antibiotics came in brown bottles and operating rooms had concrete walls. The needle was beveled. The catheter was flexible plastic. The whole assembly could fit in her palm. She tore the packaging open with her teeth. "Sarah." "What are you?" a voice from the doorway. Another nurse, Diane, arriving for her rounds. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have time for protocol or explanations or the bureaucratic dance that said she was not allowed to do what her body was already doing. She found the intercostal space, second rib, midclavicular line on Morrison's right side. Her fingers marked the spot with anatomical precision. The skin was cool. She could feel his ribs beneath the surface, could count them by touch alone. She swabbed the area with an alcohol pad, steady hand, and the smell of antiseptic cut through the sterile hospital air. Morrison gasped again, his oxygen saturation now at 71%. His lips were taking on a faint bluish cast. The needle went in. Not tentatively. Not with doubt. With the same certainty that had gotten her through 6 minutes of enemy fire with a bleeding child in one arm and her sidearm in the other. The needle penetrated skin, muscle, the thin membrane of the pleura, and then came the sound she was listening for. The hiss of air escaping. A faint, rapid wheeze as the pressure inside Morrison's chest suddenly had somewhere to go. Oxygen saturation climbed. 75. The monitor caught it first. Sarah's eyes tracked the numbers rising. 82. His breathing came easier. 88. The color began returning to his lips. 91. His hand, which had been clawing at the bedside rail, released. 94. Stable. She secured the catheter with tape, her fingers moving through the final steps with a mechanic's efficiency, threading the plastic tube, taping it down, checking the seal. The whole procedure had taken 43 seconds. Morrison's breathing began to normalize, his eyes refocusing, his body understanding that the war for oxygen was over. Diane stood frozen in the doorway. Her hand was still on the light switch. Behind her, Sarah could hear the shuffle of feet as other nurses from the night shift stopped in the corridor. "Get me a chest X-ray," Sarah said. Not a question. A directive. Her voice had dropped 2 octaves. "And someone call Dr. Sterling and tell him his post-op complication just became an emergency intervention. Full field documentation on the procedure start time and completion. 2:47 to 3:30 a.m. "Sarah, you're not authorized," Diane started. "The patient was in respiratory arrest. I performed needle decompression. The chest cavity was compromised. The procedure saved his life." Sarah stepped back from the bedside, and her hands were steady. Completely, impossibly steady. Her heart rate was elevated, she could feel it in her temples, but her voice came out level as a surgeon's scalpel. "The documentation goes in the chart. Every second of it. Including what time I intervened and how many seconds until his O2 stabilized." She turned to leave, and that's when one of the younger nurses, Tyler, maybe, or Travis, said something that made the room go dead silent. "Who were you talking to before you went in?" Sarah paused, her hand on the door frame. The question wasn't accusatory. It was confused. Curious. Because she hadn't been talking to anyone. Except she had been, just not out loud. She had been talking in her head in a language that wasn't English, in the voice of a SEAL Team 3 commanding officer who had been dead for 12 years, the kind of conversation that happened in the muscle memory of hands that had learned how to save lives in places where the rules were written in blood instead of hospital policy. But that wasn't the worst part. It wasn't the procedure itself that was going to bring Sterling down. It wasn't even the fact that she had technically violated hospital authorization. It was Morrison's chart, the one Diane was already pulling up, where his post-op complication summary would go into the system, and from there into the insurance database, and from there into Morrison's full medical file. And somewhere in that file, buried in the surgical history section, was a name that connected 2 timelines, the name of a classified operation in Tikrit where a senior chief petty officer had risked everything to save a child's life, and the name of an Army Ranger named James Morrison, age 27. Whose childhood medical history included a bilateral lung injury sustained during an evacuation of a collapsed building when he was 8 years old. Sterling had no idea what she had just done. He was probably asleep. He was probably dreaming about performance reviews and board meetings and the careful architecture of his career built on the backs of people like Sarah, people who knew how to disappear, how to swallow humiliation, how to keep their hands steady while the world told them they were nobody. But Morrison was already reaching for his phone, his breathing now steady enough to form words, and the first thing he was going to do was look at the night nurse who had just saved his life, and the second thing he was going to do was ask why her hands had moved like she had done this 1,000 times before, and the third thing, the thing that would change everything, was he was going to notice the small tattoo on her left wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve, partially visible in the fluorescent light, a set of coordinates in military notation that didn't match any hospital in Portland or any city in the continental United States. Sterling entered the trauma bay at 11:02 p.m. to find Sarah standing motionless over Morrison's bed, her hand still on the catheter she'd inserted between his ribs. The monitor sang its normal rhythm. O2 sat 96. Blood pressure climbing toward something livable. She hadn't moved. Hadn't turned around. Hadn't done anything except steady a man's breathing with a procedure that wasn't hers to perform. He saw the violation before he saw the save. Step away from the patient. His voice carried the edge of a man watching his carefully constructed order collapse in real time. Sarah turned. Met his eyes. Said nothing. In that silence, Sterling's mind calculated faster than his mouth could move. Protocol breach. Scope of practice violation. Documentation. Board notification. This wasn't humiliation anymore. This was ammunition. You performed an emergency decompression without authorization. That's a level 1 incident. His oxygen was 68. Sarah's voice remained level, the voice of someone reporting weather. Trachea deviated. He had for minutes before cardiac arrest. You're a registered nurse, not a trauma surgeon. Policy is explicit. Sterling's phone was already in his hand, muscle memory of Empire Building taking over. He stepped into the corridor, dialing before the door closed behind him. His mentor on the hospital board picked up on the second ring, voice thick with late-night irritation that transformed immediately into attention the moment Sterling began speaking. We have a situation with one of the night staff. Sarah Chen. RN, night shift, just overstepped catastrophically. Performed an advanced intervention without authorization. I need documentation started immediately. Yes. Tonight. He hung up and scrolled through his contacts, finding the staffing agency that had placed Sarah 3 years ago. The director's voicemail clicked on. Sterling left a message requesting verification of credentials and references for Sarah Chen, specifically regarding any advanced certifications or military background. His tone suggested he already knew something didn't add up. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. The staffing director's callback was careful, measured, wrong in ways that made Sterling's predator instincts activate. Dr. Sterling, regarding Ms. Chen, I'm afraid our records are somewhat limited. Standard RN certification. Background check cleared. Beyond that, I'm not at liberty to discuss. Not at liberty. Those 4 words told Sterling everything he needed to know. Someone else owned this woman's file. Someone higher. Someone he could still use. He called an outside risk management consultant at midnight, something he'd prepared for, something he'd been building toward. I need documentation on a protocol violation. Potential patient endangerment masked as heroism. Get to Sacred Heart, review the incident, give me something I can use. The consultant quoted $15,000 for an expedited report. Sterling authorized it without negotiation. 48 hours became a file. A file became a justification. A justification became law. Security Chief Lloyd Thompson arrived at 6:43 a.m. carrying a cardboard box and the weight of a man who understood exactly what was happening but had learned long ago not to ask questions. Sarah's locker had been cleared already. Thompson had done it himself, her possessions gathered without ceremony. A cracked mug from a VA hospital gift shop in San Antonio. A succulent plant, nearly dead, its leaves curling inward like hands surrendering. A photograph of 5 SEALs in combat gear, faces lean, eyes the color of people who'd seen things that didn't have words. The photo was old, from a time when it was still legal to exist. Come with me. Thompson's voice carried the gentleness of someone executing orders he disagreed with. Sterling's office smelled like expensive cologne and the particular air pressure of a man who'd just won. Sarah sat across from his desk, the termination papers already printed, waiting only for her signature. Sterling had dressed for the occasion, navy suit, gold cufflinks, the uniform of institutional victory. You understand the severity. It wasn't a question. You performed a medical procedure outside your scope of practice. You created liability exposure we cannot tolerate. This facility has a responsibility to maintain standards. He watched her hands. They didn't shake. They never shook. That was the thing that had started to bother him, that no matter what he said, how public the humiliation, how cutting the dismissal, she absorbed it like water absorbs rain. Like it all fell through her and disappeared. I understand. Sarah picked up the pen. Her handwriting was precise, each letter measured. Heroics without credentials are just liability. Sterling leaned back in his chair, the line rehearsed, the line that would make sense to the board, the line that would protect him from any suggestion that he'd terminated someone for insubordination when really he'd terminated someone for the unforgivable crime of being better than he was. I'm sure you'll find work elsewhere. with the right references. She signed the second page. Removed her badge, the photo showing a woman in blue scrubs, unremarkable, erased. Placed it on his desk. The click of plastic on mahogany sounded like a door closing. The rain started before she reached Burnside. Not the gentle rain of Portland's reputation, but the kind that came sideways, that soaked through fabric, that turned the world into something impressionistic and wrong. She sat at the bus stop bench at 7:22 a.m. with a cardboard box on her lap, rain hammering the plastic shelter above her, rain soaking through her coat, rain so absolute it felt personal. The mug was cracked along its rim. The succulent was brown on 3 sides. The photograph showed 5 men who officially never existed, performing a mission that officially never happened, in a country where she'd been ordered to forget she'd ever been. Her phone had 63 missed calls. Her voicemail was full by message 32. Her bank account had $847 in it. Her apartment lease ended in 3 weeks. Her references had suddenly stopped returning calls. Everything she'd built to stay invisible had worked too well. When she became truly invisible, nobody could catch her. She looked at the photograph. At the SEAL team leader whose name she could never speak. At the man she'd loved, who loved her enough to agree to the erasure, to the disappearance, to the fiction that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had died in 2004 so that Captain Michael Pierce could keep breathing in 2024. He'd moved on. Married. Had 2 daughters who'd never know that their father owed his life to a woman who'd decided to stop existing. The rain drummed against the shelter like Morse code nobody was translating. She held the photograph. Considered the bus stop bench, the rain, the cardboard box, the $300 in her checking account, the fact that disappearing had felt like living for 20 years and now it felt like drowning. Her hands that had held people together while gunfire turned buildings to dust, began to shake for the first time since Sterling's office, and she almost threw the photograph into the rain, almost let it dissolve into the gutter water, almost accepted that the ghost of Tikrit should have stayed dead. But then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in Portland traffic. A sound that meant altitude and purpose. The distant thud-thud-thud growing closer, rotating through the morning sky. Sarah's head lifted. The rain fell. The bus stop bench stayed empty except for one woman holding a cracked mug and a photograph of people who didn't exist. The sound grew louder. Changed pitch. Became real. A UH-60M Black Hawk cut through the clouds over downtown Portland, its rotors shaking the rain sideways. The helicopter descended through Portland's wet evening like something from another world, rotors slicing rain into fragments. Morrison heard it first, a low percussion that made the monitors skip a beat. He pulled himself upright despite the pain, his foreline creating an arc of resistance as he moved toward the window. The nurses scattered. That's when Khalid arrived. The orderly wheeled him in at 6:56 p.m., his left leg wrapped in compression bandages, his eyes moving methodically across the recovery ward like someone counting exits. He was thin. Weathered. The kind of thin that comes from survival rather than genetics. They'd admitted him 3 hours earlier through the ER, Khalid Hassan, translator seeking asylum, torn ligament from a car accident in southeast Portland, complaining of persistent headaches that the doctors couldn't locate on any scan. Morrison didn't pay attention until Khalid rolled past and spotted the visitor log. It was a small laminated clipboard on the edge of the nightstand, the kind hospitals used to track who's come through. Sarah's name was there, 3 visits, all night shifts, all with times penciled in beside the date. Khalid's eyes stopped moving. They locked on those for letters, CHEN. His skin did something Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. It went the color of old newsprint, the kind of white that doesn't come from pain but from recognition. Khalid's hand reached up. He touched his chest, right above his heart, and his lips moved without sound. "You all right?" Morrison asked. His voice came out rough. He'd been asking people this question every day since he woke up post-op, and every day they gave the same answer, the polite one, the lie. This time Khalid's silence was different. It was the silence of a man trying to compute something that didn't fit into any known language. Morrison reached for his call button. Started to press it. No. Khalid's hand stopped him. His accent was thick, his English precise in the way of someone who learned it in emergency situations. No doctors. Not yet. He wheeled his bed closer. The hydraulics hissed. The woman. The nurse who comes at night. What is her rank? What? Morrison had never thought of it. Sarah was just Sarah. She moved like she owned the hallway but never made any noise doing it. She'd been there when he crashed 3 days ago, before the code team, before anyone else. Her hands had done something to his chest, some kind of emergency procedure he'd been told about but couldn't quite remember through the morphine fog. She's a nurse. Khalid's jaw clenched. He closed his eyes and when he opened them again, there was something burning there. Something Morrison recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors after bad operations. In Tikrit, 2004, there was a building. A school. When the bomb came down, he stopped. Swallowed. The Americans had a unit there. Jock. Task force. One of them was a medic. A woman. We called her the ghost because nobody could see her until she was right beside you, and then. He gestured at his own chest, where a thin scar ran beneath his collarbone. Twice. She saved me twice that day. Once when the ceiling fell. Once when the bleeding wouldn't stop. Morrison's hand moved to his own chest without his permission. The bandages were still there, fresh enough that the tape pulled at his skin. That scar. How old? Khalid pointed. 3 days. Pneumothorax. Morrison could barely say the word. His eyes were moving now, moving down to the clipboard, to the name written there in blue pen. That's not possible. Her rank. Tell me. I don't know her rank. She's just. Morrison reached for the clipboard with a tremor starting in his hand. The medication made things slow and distant, but not this. This cut through everything. His file was in the drawer. His whole medical record, the incident report from 3 days ago, the one that mentioned a procedure performed by an unauthorized staff member. His hands shook as he pulled it open. The paper was crisp, official, the kind of document that made everything real. The report mentioned an unnamed special operations medical specialist. Not by name. Not by rank. Just those words, special operations medical specialist. Morrison's breath caught. He was 28 years old. He deployed 4 times. He knew what that term meant. It meant classified. It meant officially erased. The door to the recovery ward burst open at 6:58 p.m. Commander Price of SEAL Team 3 walked in with his dress uniform somehow still pressed despite the Portland weather, his bearing the kind of thing that made the fluorescent light seem too bright and the room suddenly too small. Behind him came 2 FBI agents, their badges clipped to their belts like promises. The commander's eye swept across the ward, registered Khalid's presence, then locked onto Morrison's bed. Private First Class Morrison. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in military precision. I need to speak with you about the evening of your procedure. Sterling arrived before anyone could answer. He came through the south entrance, his suit somehow tailored tighter than it had been that morning, his face already registering calculation. He saw the uniforms and his expression shifted. Not fear. Something colder. Something that looked like he was already doing math that didn't add up. This is a patient care matter, Sterling began, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone used to dismissing authority that came from somewhere other than a hospital organizational chart. I'm the chief of surgery here. Any questions about protocol should come through my office. Commander Price didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he stepped beside Morrison's bed and began speaking in a voice that didn't need to be raised because it already owned the room. The woman you know as a night shift nurse. She was deployed to Tikrit, Iraq, in a classified capacity with Task Force 121. During a structural collapse on March 15, 2004, she performed emergency field surgery on 2 civilians while under active fire. Bronze Star for that action. Silver Star for a subsequent operation. A second Silver Star for a hostage extraction that took place 4 days later. And a Navy Cross. He paused. Each medal got its own beat, its own moment of weight. The highest award for heroism not involving his own life. She earned that in the same theater. On the same deployment. 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds. All of this is classified. All of her service record was sealed by the Pentagon. She was ordered to disappear and maintain that cover. Sterling's face had gone the color of old wall paint. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without producing sound. An FBI agent stepped forward, her badge catching the overhead light. Ms. Chen was extracted from active service in 2004 following her involvement in dismantling a weapons network that resulted in 3 assassination attempts against her life. She's been living under protective cover for 20 years. No public military record. No official recognition. The order to maintain silence came directly from JSOC command. The recovery ward had gone completely silent. The monitors kept beeping. The ventilators kept breathing their mechanical rhythm. But everything else, the entire universe seemed to be holding its breath. Sterling started to back up. His hand found the edge of a chair and he gripped it like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His network of board connections, the careful structure of political favors and leverage he'd spent 20 years building, all of it was evaporating in real time. The hospital's legal team had already been called. The words federal liability and classified military personnel and protected status were already being assembled into sentences by attorneys in suits that cost more than his car payment. Security Chief Thompson appeared in Sterling's office at 7:14 p.m. He was carrying a cardboard box. The same kind of box Sterling had handed to Sarah a week earlier. The box still had some of her dust on it, the kind of dust that accumulates in emergency shelters and break rooms where nobody wants to sit down long enough to settle. Thompson set the box on Sterling's desk without ceremony. His face was composed, professional, the face of a man who had decided not to pass judgment but simply to execute a task that had become inevitable. "I believe you know the way out," Thompson said, and those were the only words anyone needed. By 7:22 p.m., Sterling was escorted from the building by 2 federal agents. They didn't use handcuffs at the hospital entrance because procedure required discretion in medical settings, but everyone watching, the nurses, the orderlies, the visitors waiting in the lobby, knew what was happening. They knew the calculation had ended. They knew the score. 6 months later, a plaque appeared on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart Hospital. The Chen Recovery Ward. A whole wing dedicated to trauma and post-operative care for service members. Sarah worked the night shift there, moving between beds with the same efficiency she'd always carried, but now the weight was different. Lighter somehow. The invisibility was gone. The orders to disappear were rescinded. She still wore scrubs, still performed rounds, still moved through hallways with measured steps, but now when people looked at her, they saw something different. They saw competence. They saw someone who had chosen this work not because she had to hide but because she wanted to heal. Morrison kept his combat boots polished and placed by his apartment door in the northeast Portland neighborhood where he'd rented a small place with a view of Mount Hood. He never wore them anymore. His left side still ached on cold mornings and the doctors said the nerve damage might be permanent. But he polished those boots every Sunday because they represented something specific, the fact that a woman had saved him twice, in 2 different decades, with the same steady hands. The first time he'd been 8 years old and trapped under rubble. The second time he'd been 28 and his lung was collapsing. Same hands. Same quiet competence. Same refusal to accept that death got the final word. On a Tuesday evening in December, Sarah was leaving the hospital at 7:38 a.m. after her night shift, and Morrison was waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe on the 1st floor. He didn't say anything at first. They stood there in the early morning light filtering through the windows, and Morrison finally understood why she'd never made a big deal out of recognizing him. She already knew. She'd always known. The moment she saw his name on the admit board 3 weeks ago, she'd done the math instantly. 8-year-old Khalid Hassan, now 28-year-old James Morrison, Army Ranger, recovering from complications of tension pneumothorax. "Your shift over?" he asked finally. "Just ending," Sarah said. She took the coffee. Not because she was thirsty, but because the gesture meant something. It meant he was treating her like a person instead of a legend. It meant the chapter where she disappeared could finally close. They walked out into the Portland morning together, neither of them speaking, because some forms of gratitude don't require language. The rain had cleared. The sky was starting to show gray along the horizon, the kind of gray that precedes dawn in the Pacific Northwest. Meanwhile, Dr. Sterling was working a folding table at the Lloyd Center Mall, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who barely made eye contact. His name tag read Steve. His suit was from a discount outlet. The other salespeople didn't know he'd been a surgeon. He flinched whenever anyone called him doctor, as if the word itself was a wound that wouldn't close. At night he went home to an apartment in Gresham, poured bourbon into a water glass, and tried not to think about the woman whose name he'd spent 6 months trying to bury. The woman who wouldn't stay buried. The woman who'd saved a patient he'd been trying to destroy, not because it was necessary but because she'd threatened his careful hierarchy of power and control. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from understanding, finally, that some people are made of substance and some people are made of angles. Some people build from darkness and some people build from light. Some people disappear and some people refuse to stay disappeared. Scars tell stories. The scar on Morrison's chest told the story of a woman who wouldn't abandon the people she'd sworn to protect, even when the government told her to. Even when the cost of staying visible was the cost of her entire identity. Even when she could have walked away and no one would have ever known. Sarah Chen moved through the newly renamed recovery ward, checking vitals, reading monitors, placing her steady hands on the shoulders of patients who needed to know that someone was watching. Someone was there. Someone would not let them die alone. That's what it meant to be a warrior without a uniform. That's what it meant to choose healing over recognition. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. So here's my question for you: if you could save someone's life by disappearing, would you do it? If keeping someone safe meant erasing yourself from the record books, from recognition, from the official story, would you take that burden? Because somewhere tonight, someone with the same skill and courage Sarah Chen carries is working a job where nobody knows her story. Nobody knows what she's done. Nobody knows the weight she's carrying. She chose that silence. She chose that invisibility. So the real question isn't whether you'd recognize a hero if she walked past you. The question is, what would you do if you discovered you'd already been saved by someone you never even saw? Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me, have you ever been completely wrong about someone until the truth came out?